Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the IFAMA 2020 Goes Digital show. This is the third edition of Dutch Agriculture, the history of Dutch agriculture. The other day, I sat down with Niek Koning. Actually, he is far off a relative of the famous Dutch painter Willem de Kooning with two O's. His name is with one O. He is a social scientist. He is well versed in everything: economics, agriculture, sociology, history. He is really a homo universalis in the history of agriculture. Today, Krijn Poppe, who is probably the Dutch economist, the leading economist on agriculture and everything that is going around in this country, because we're moving from one crisis to another, and he sees that and he comments on that from an economical perspective. And I'm sitting here with the man with the beard, Merijn Knibbe. Merijn Knibbe will be remembered in history as the economic historian who put grass on the map. And that is because it's our main crop. Nobody knew until Merijn put it on. But he is an economic historian who specializes in agriculture. And basically, his statistics is the underlying knowledge Niek Koning used for his thesis. So the two of them go way back, and they've put history on the map. And that kind of history is what we're going to discuss today. When I introduced this history of Dutch agriculture, I said, and I created a caricature, a Dutch farmer could feed 3 people at the beginning of the 19th century, whereas a French and a German farmer could only feed 2. It doesn't seem much, but it's a difference of 50%. How come? And that has to do with history. Niek showed his view. You've all seen it. It's linked in the text underneath this video. We're going to continue this conversation with Merijn and Krijn commenting on Niek's views. And Merijn, I'll first go to you. You said when preparing this interview that you fully agree with Niek. So that's boring. But you don't agree on something. What is that something?
Well, don't agree. I would like to elaborate some things which Niek mentions. Niek says the location of Dutch agriculture is very important, and that is true. Fertile lands in between different very large concentrations of population. Think of London, think of also the Randstad in the Netherlands, Amsterdam, The Hague, etc. But also the Ruhrgebiet in Germany, Paris. It's all not that far away, which enables Dutch farmers to export a lot, to sell a lot, and which has not been a recent development, but which has been going on for quite some time. I mean, centuries back, farmers from the north and the east and the south already exported dairy, but also grains to cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam. But what I would like to elaborate is that these locational advantages, they give possibilities, and using these possibilities changes these very locations and aspects. This can be for the worse, this can be for the better. And in the Netherlands, this was often for the better. One example is a social one, a socio-economic one. If you look at Marxist economics, they say, well, hey, what was important was the growth of a labor class. We came from a situation without a real labor class, and then became industry, and you got the growth of people dependent on wage labor for the families. Well, that was in the Netherlands not really industry-related, but agriculture-related. The growth of agriculture, using more labor, sometimes somewhat larger farms, more intensive kinds of agriculture. Farming needed more labor, and that happened to be wage labor. And that what you see in Friesland, in Drenthe, that you get a class of people living in the villages, sometimes living in cities, who were dependent on wage labor in agriculture. You get a kind of capitalist agriculture.
And when was that? When was that, this capitalist agriculture we had? subsistence farming, but it was capitalist already.
Yeah, it differs a bit from the region. In Friesland, which I specialize in a little, it was in the 16th century.
And Merijn, Friesland, our international viewers don't know that Friesland and Drenthe are provinces.
Yeah, you're totally right. In the north of the Netherlands, this was maybe the 16th century. In the west, where all the big cities are, it was probably somewhat earlier. And I'm using, if I remember well, the definition of Niek for capitalist agriculture, that more than 50% of the labor used is wage labor, if I remember well. Niek?
Yes, that was the yeah.
It is
you need some concrete.
I saw Krijn raising his hand. So Krijn, because we said we agreed on we'll break into one another's words. Krijn, what did you want to say?
Well, just to add to Merijn, that I think the first examples of this capitalist agriculture were around 1300 in Zeeland. Zeeland is a province in the southwest that gave its name to New Zealand, but in Old Zealand, capitalist agriculture or agriculture as such developed around in the Middle Ages between 1000 and 1300, because you had the big cities already of Bruges, Ghent in now Flanders, and London, 80,000 people, Ghent 60,000. Largest city in the Netherlands, Dordrecht, 5,000 people. And you saw already at a certain moment that industrialists in the cities were taking over some parts of agriculture, like creating salt from our peat soils, as well as some industrial crops for paints.
Okay, so let's go back to Merijn now. So agriculture developed in a capitalist way already in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, and what I would like to stress that one of the aspects of this was the growth of a labor class. Population growth located in villages and leading to a class of people. And this is often called Marxism, but in fact, all the classical economists noticed this and were agreed with this. Marx was a classical economist. It's not a Marxist view.
But did this happen, Merijn? It didn't happen in Germany. It didn't happen in France the way it happened in our country. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. Because
it's not, let's say, it didn't happen in southern Germany, but it certainly happened in northern Germany and certainly in eastern Germany. It also happened in the region around Paris. And so, in fact, what Merijn says is totally true. But you see this development in all well-located, advantaged areas in Europe.
If there are cities, this will happen.
If there are fertile soils, if there are a lot of commercial possibilities, then in a certain, as long as we are in a pre-industrial society where population growth leads to higher agricultural prices, this happens. It all changes from the end of the 19th century.
Right.
Yes, and this was not just local labor, but we all know agriculture has strong seasonal peaks in the demand for labor. So you also got migratory labor, flows of migratory labor, which are not recent. We still have these asparagus and whatever in horticulture. Hundreds of thousands of people come to the agricultural centers in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, and go back when the harvest is to go. These systems go back for centuries. So that's one example of location changing because of taking advantage of the possibilities of the location. Another example is, the Netherlands specialized on dairy, especially in Holland and Friesland. And to an extent, this was because of this location, but not just economic. But when we have all these peat soils, the Netherlands is a drained swamp, and when you start to use peat soils for agriculture, and especially for arable agriculture, but also for dairy, they start to disappear because it's peat. It's organic, it will oxidize. this meant that these peat soils started to disappear because they were used for agriculture and became lower and lower and lower, which means that more and more and more water was coming in, which needed that we had to improve drainage, which we, in the long run, not always in 10 or 20 years, but in the long run, we managed to improve drainage and waterways, which enabled us to get more efficient systems of transport over water, but also forced us to go on with dairy agriculture, because of livestock agriculture, because low-lying land is not fit for arable. So it forced us to specialize further in a direction which we were already taking. So that is location breeds location, and you see this in a multitude of ways, and you still see this. We have this highly specialized agriculture, and we still have the migratory flows of labor.
But Merijn, hang on, because what critical organizations now want is to get rid of our livestock exploitation. So there are too many animals in this country, that's what we say. But what you're saying is that location that breeded livestock farming. Is that correct?
It sure is. First, this was livestock farming in the bovine sector, but from the end of the 19th century on, when transport was increasingly cheap, we started to import these grains and also feed cakes. Feed cakes are fed to the cows, grains to the pigs, and we get another example of a sector which is growing and growing. You get advantages of scale, which makes it even more efficient to grow the sector. You see it with the pigs, with the chicken, with the eggs, even with the mink farms, which use, with a lot of pigs, we slaughter them, which produce a lot of meat, but also a lot of garbage, which is fed to the mink. We get a whole large, economically efficient process, but which is fully dependent on a very large flows of...
And that again is location breeding location.
Yeah, location breeding location. You use advantages, and because you use them, you get economies of scale, so the advantages become even larger in an economic sense, but this, of course, can have all kinds of ecological and whatever drawbacks.
Thanks. So what you're saying is location indeed breeds location, and we excel in breeding location. This dried swamp, the Netherlands is, lost its arable land. It became a livestock country, and we've bred that advantage. We created and we really developed that advantage of the location, and we excel in that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Other examples are tulips or cucumbers or tomatoes. Again and again, you see this taking advantage of location, of economies of scale, which also require a lot of knowledge to do this, and we were able to develop this knowledge. But again and again and again, you see this using your advantages, and by using them, making them even more advantageous.
Maybe it's good to add that this happened especially in the western part of the country and the western central part of the country, where you had the big rivers, and in Friesland, so the northwest. But of course, the Netherlands was not a homogeneous country. So in Groningen and in Zeeland, they had fertile clay soils. So they remained arable areas, but they also saw this development towards a kind of capitalist agriculture until the late 19th century. And then, of course, you had the southeastern parts of the Netherlands, which had poor sandy soils, and their agriculture remains much more small scale, somewhat less commercialized, more like you see in adjacent German areas.
Right. Krijn, let's go to you now. What did you think of Niek's way of presenting Dutch history and the thesis of Merijn, location breeds location? But first, respond to the image of history Niek was creating.
I think I'll totally agree with his analysis in that sense. Well, I should say I'm not a historian, I'm a current day economist. But if I look to it, if I try to add something to his view, I think it's important to realize for me, the relationship between city and countryside. I find that fascinating. And like in the story of Niek and Merijn, it is, for an economist, it are the classical factor costs. So it is labor costs that tend to be high in the neighborhood of cities. There's always an opportunity. You can work in the city, farmer's son can go to the city. There is a capital. How much do you pay for interest? That has been historically very low in the Netherlands compared to other countries. Since the 1600s, the Amsterdam Exchange, we have one of the lowest interest rates in the world.
Do you agree, Merijn? You are the statistics guy.
Yes, maybe not yet in the 15th century. Science about 15. I have theories on this. But generally, you see lower and lower and lower interest rates, and science about 1600. It's really low, not just for the government, but also for people.
Exactly.
Borrowing money.
Yeah, and you also see, go to the UNESCO site of the Beemster, that some of these polders, that's another fascinating thing, that you have an environmental problem because they take out the peat soils, that is the end of land, it creates a lake, and then money from the cities earned in Amsterdam or in the area where I live, near Rotterdam, earned in the 19th century in what is now Indonesia as a colony, is invested to drain the land and to drain the lake and to make it a clay soil again. And later on, like Schiphol, it becomes an airport. But there you see large investments from also the city into that countryside. So for me, it's labor cost, it is capital, that relation. And then for individual farmers, the cost of the land. Of course, there is Ricardo's rent theory. If you go to the classical economists, that says, well, the value of the land is in the end a rent, a result. But for an individual farmer, that high land cost forces him to intensify. And you have examples even in this age of, or in the last age of, farmers starting with arable and then going into vegetables and in the end going into glasshouse horticulture and even moving up in value added per hectare from cucumbers to expensive flowers, for instance. So these relationships that I think transform agriculture as much as it is the fact that you have a competitive position vis-a-vis France or whatever in feeding people. That's what I would like to add to, I think, Niek's great story of the history.
So it's access to capital. And
access to capital. Cost and access to capital. So then you get what Hayami and Rattan call the induced innovation theory. For those viewers that don't know the story, they compare Japan and the US. The US, high labor costs, low land prices. Labor had to be to come from Europe, like we got labor from Germany, and Japan the other way around, a lot of labor and very high land costs. And then you see that the innovation in the US gave us McCormick and John Deere mechanization that later came to Europe. We didn't invent that. And in Japan, it goes into raising the land productivity with water investments, etc.
But even the low interest rates fit in a way in that induced innovation theory.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because of the location, we were trade became important. Amsterdam was in the 17th century more or less the most important trading center of the Western world. And then, of course, you see financial innovations to facilitate trade. And those innovations and the innovations in governance make it possible that interest rates become lower than in other parts of Europe. That's the way, indeed, it happened. What Krijn says is very important. Indeed, you had commercial ventures into draining lands or creating polders, etc. In the early 19th century, Rotterdam capitalists created a big capitalist farm in Zeeland, the southwestern part of the countries. For the Americans, it will not sound big. It was 1,600 hectares, but for the Netherlands, that was huge. But all this lasted to the late 19th century. And then the economic dynamic of agriculture changed. And you see that that growing dependence on wage labor changes into a decreasing dependence on wage labor. And then you see a return to economically smaller scaled farms, basically dependent on the farmer and his family. So wage labor then becomes less important. It remains very commercialized, but it's no longer capitalist in the sense that it systematically depended on wage labor.
And
until the last decades, for then in certain sectors like horticulture and intensive livestock farming, you see again a growth of dependence on wage labor. And often migrant labor today mainly coming from Eastern Europe.
Now, Niek, that is very important. And I was already tempted to interrupt Merijn and to make a comparison to migrant labor today, which is an issue, a real big issue. You've learned something new, so I learned something new. We've developed a very commercial capitalist way agriculture since the Middle Ages. It was already there. And then we went back to what we nowadays call family farming. Family farms that aren't subsistence farms. They work in a commercial system, but the farmer is again a family farmer and not a capitalist farmer anymore. But then again, in horticulture, it's dependent on migrant labor, not own labor from our own country, but imported, as the smaller German farmers did. How did all of this happen since the 19th century? That is what you were explaining. How come we went back to a family farm system?
You're asking this to me or to Merijn?
Yeah. To anyone, but to you. Yeah.
Well, in my view, so say in the mid-19th century, we had the real industrial revolution, which was a fossil fuels revolution. And that had effects like the transport revolution, railways, steamships, which made it possible to grow grain in the American prairies and ship it to London and to other parts of Europe. Also, another effect was that it allowed non-food products to be produced from fossil fuels rather than from agricultural products. Krijn, I think, was talking about Zeeland farming, which was producing dye stuffs like madder, make-up in Dutch, madder in English. Well, that was outcompeted by aniline, a synthetic products based on coal. And that happened with, so a lot of industrial crops were replaced with synthetic products based on fossil fuels. So in a way, the demand was moderated, the supply was stimulated, also by artificial fertilizer, motorized irrigation, and you name it. And that created an oversupply dynamic in the agricultural world market. And then agriculture became less profitable and less interesting. It was no longer an interesting field for investments by real substantial capitalist investors. And so it was increasingly left to, you could say, left to the workers itself. So to self-employed farmers. At this moment, I'm not at my home. I'm on the farm of a friend who is an arable farmer in Zeeland. Well, here in Zeeland, in the mid-19th century, that was really capitalist farming. My friend here is farming with his son and with his brother. So that is what was formerly really capitalist farming has again become a kind of family farming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Merijn,
in fact, that happened all over the developed parts of the Western world. Only in the less developed parts, farmers were able to, wage labor was so cheap that they could continue for some time.
the energy revolution changed everything and recreated, in fact, family farming. Merijn, I saw Krijn nodding. He agrees on this view. Merijn, do you agree on, is this the right way of presenting things?
I agree on what happened. I would just like to add that, well, of course this happened. One farmer could handle 15 cows about 15 years ago and 115 today. So it's a huge change in productivity. But not all this labor disappeared because the farms have also shedded a lot of labor. Very well known is, of course, shedding making butter to the factory, but there's a lot of other things would have been shedded. One is the transport function of farms. In the olden days, with the horse and the carriage, farmers took their products to the market, a transport function. This has totally been replaced by other companies. And you have the loan worker, I do not know the name in English.
Contractor.
What do you say?
A contractor.
A contractor who do all kind of work on different farms, harvesting and whatever. And so a lot of labor has also been shedded, but this shedding was just part of going back to the family farm, in combination with huge increases in productivity. And while this is on a personal point, not everybody is glad with these increases in productivity. They have a romantic idea of how farming used to be, but I challenge them to go in the autumn, in the rain, harvesting potatoes on your knees with your bare hands. Well, that used to be like that, and that has been changed too. So automation has also very positive points for people, but that's a personal point.
Krijn, you were raising your hand?
Well, I think that Merijn makes an interesting point. That is that the definition of a farm or the activities of a farm change over time. So if we talk in modern jargon, we would say you have to look to the food system. And there is a constant economic power or drive, I should say, an economic drive to look to that borders what is on the farm and what is with specialized companies. So it is a characteristic of capitalist agriculture or agriculture in a capitalist society that the way the food chain is organized is by economic incentives. And that means that at a certain moment, butter moves to the factories. Butter was something farmers' women did. And in a lot of Dutch regions, that was the start of the egg production in the Netherlands. Egg production in the Netherlands has been built up by farmers' wives who in the past did butter on the farm. The same indeed for transport, that type of things. So issues there also in specialization, in economies of scale, are solved by this process of how to organize. Organization is an economic thing. And it leads in the end, in the current situation, that the most risky things that you can't easily control from the stock market, so to say, or from an outsider, are left to the farmer.
So this is the energy revolution. In the end, the energy revolution led to the creation of a food chain, a specialized food chain. That's what we're saying.
All parts of all activities on the farm that traditionally were done by farmers, but where there were economies of scale, were split off from agriculture to industry and trading companies. And farming was reduced really to the basic primary activity of growing crops, having livestock, handling livestock, etc. So of course.
Niek. So what you're now saying is that the old capitalist farmer who became a family farmer was reduced in his new role to he got a producer of commodities, whereas as a capitalist farmer he produced end products.
Yes,
yeah, exactly.
So I am now on this farm in Zeeland and coming here, cycling on my bike, we passed by an old madder stove, I think you can call it. So it was a processing facility for madder, an industrial crop. Well, those processing facilities were on-farm facilities. Often they were too large for one farm, but then you had 8 or 6 of those bigger farmers who together created that processing facility. Yeah. The same is true for cane sugar in Brazil. The big plantations had their own sugar mills. The first sugar factories had their own, at least partly their own, sugar beet farms. All this split because primary farming became unprofitable, so all activities where you had scale advantages became separated from agriculture. And then agriculture, of course, had to be somehow linked to those processing and trading activities. And at first, the link was simply the free market, but gradually processing companies had the need for more technical control over primary production because they wanted to control the quality and the components and the exact time of delivery, etc. And then you got what you called chain integration. And chain integration means, in fact, that those activities that had been split off and had become capitalist companies, so to speak, and they wanted to regain their control on primary farming, which first was split off to self-employed farmers because it was no longer profitable.
Now that is very interesting. And now I'm confused. I don't know what to do because we just this is a beautiful sketch of the history of farming. It was in our part of urbanized areas with fertile soils, this will happen. And once the Industrial Revolution comes around, you get the economies of scale, you get an organized food chain that optimizes economies of scale and specialized. So everyone has his specialized jobs, and the farmer is being reduced to a commodities producer. And that is where his position is. And then we could move on. I think this is very special. This is a very good analysis. I'm thrilled because now we want to go back to our short circuits, to what we call in Dutch korte ketens. And we see that it's a very romantic idea because you cannot feed the world, or you can feed it in a very expensive way because they can never compete with the economies of scale of the specialized food chain. What do we do now? Shall we stop this interview and start a new one with a vision on the future? Because that's it's a very important topic, but it's a topic on its own. So I suggest that we stop this conversation and that we do a next one. Merijn.
I would like to add one thing. Niek mentioned the fossil fuel revolution, which was incredibly important. There has been in agriculture another revolution, and that's the biochemical measurement revolution, which was also very important. I mean, you see it everywhere from about 1900s on. A few years ago, I was at a conference in Leuven. I thought, well, let's be a little bit provocative and mention Taylor in agriculture, Taylor from Taylorism, the use of scientific measurements in industrial processes. There were 4 people there in this small part of the conference, and 3 of them also, 2 others also mentioned Taylor, kind of serendipity. What you see is loads of measurements, biochemical measurements, the quality of milk, the nutrient contents of soil, the bacteriological quality of milk, etc., etc., etc. Now I'm coming to your short chains. To do these measurements, you need laboratories, which also have their own economies of scale, which fit very well in these longer chains, which have larger volumes, and everybody uses these measurements. The Albert Heijn Delhaize, which is a large supermarket, farmers themselves. If you look at the beginning of these measurements, these were also farmers instigating this because they wanted fair payment of the products. They wanted high payments, but also fair. Fair was also as important as high payments. So if I had better milk than you, I have to get more money, not because that makes me rich, but because it's fair. And if he has better milk, he should get it. So there's also an element of fairness in the measurements, but these measurements, they permeate the whole large production chains. And I don't see how short change can change this, can incorporate this. So I think we are doomed to this large production change.
We are doomed to large production chains.
Well, I think, no, I'm too dramatic, but measurement is very important in the food chain.
And it is expensive.
And it's expensive. Which means that it's an argument to have large-scale chains. I don't say we're doomed. That was too dramatic.
Okay. Krijn, you wanted to say something. And also, let's decide what we do. Are we going to another discussion? I would be in favor of that. And let's end up this one, but you decide. First now, Krijn, to you.
Yeah, I agree with your proposal to have another conversation in the next days about what these historical analysis and understanding the system in its economic drives could mean for the future of Dutch or Northwestern European agriculture. There's one point I think before we go there that we overlook in the sense that of course, in the last 25, 30 years, we started realizing that these mechanisms that we discussed also lead to an environmental problem. What Merijn called localization breeds localization, could also say from economics that's an agglomeration effect, a cluster effect. or network effect. It means that there's very specialized companies, there are deep labor markets, there is synergy between activities. The byproduct of one process is the input for another activity. And that is a very strong mechanism. I mean, if you would design this on a design board in advance, you would not say, I need 4 or 5 boats from Brazil with soy, if I could also do 1 boat with the meat itself. And that's the feed conversion ratio. If that's 4 or 5, you transport much more feed than you could transport meat. That had partly an historical background, because you could easily transport feed and not so easily a fresh product, which is now changing or has changed. But it also is an explanation of why this cluster effect happens in the Netherlands. And then, as Merijn said, localization breeds localization. You start up the next thing. The disadvantage of that, of course, is that it leads in some cases to negative externalities, to environmental cost. It's not only positive, these synergies. Farmers are confronted with high land prices, so they intensify. Either they buy their neighbor's land and then they have to make money out of these very expensive land prices, very high land prices, or they cannot even buy their neighbor's land. They don't have the money. Nevertheless, they bought a milk robot. Then you have to take more cows on your own land. And that leads in a number of cases, also because we are so close to that water tables, to environmental negative effects. And then at the same time, we currently are in a situation where due to these immigrant flows, but also natural population growth. In the 1950s, we had 10 million people. We now nearly have 20 million. The economy is developing into a service economy. Also in industry with Greenport Eindhoven. And this then gives a certain problem that at the moment, as an outsider, I think you would say on one hand, a very innovative agriculture with amazing results per hectare, up-to-date robots, machinery. And on the other hand, these environmental problems and a big societal debate within the Netherlands where to go with this, especially the livestock industry, where in the meantime, of course, the horticultural industry and the plant side is bigger than the livestock side.
I see. I also think it's better to have another interview. I see a few possible themes. One theme is why, again, is systematic dependence on wage labor, mainly migrant wage labor in certain sectors. We knew it already in the 1950s and 60s, but from one place in the Western world, and that was California. That Californian model had something to do with labor policies, with cheap Mexican labor. And now, why did we have increasingly family farming up to the end of the 20th century? What changed? Why are we now so systematically dependent on migrant labor? And that's, I think, one possible theme. Yeah. Another possible theme is what Krijn is just saying, the environmental external effects, but not only the hard environmental external effects, but also the societal perception of the environmental problem, which has something to do with what we call the ecologische hoofdstructuur. Through a U-turn construction was brought into Natura 2000 and then was ring-fenced. The Dutch political process could no longer affect this, and this has huge consequences for Dutch agriculture. That's a theme which I view. Then connected to that, you can, in my view, a theme could be, well, Dutch primary agriculture is faced with more and more restrictions, but the Dutch agro-industrial system is a very innovative, very dynamic system, which in the last instance is not completely dependent on Dutch agriculture, but can also source outside Dutch agriculture. And what does this mean for the interest representation of agro-industry and primary farming? Are they still so parallel as they have been?
And what does it mean for...
The last thing I see is what Merijn is saying about those short change. Is that really a possible mainstream development, or will it remain a niche market thing?
Yeah,
I believe.
So, thank you very much. This is thrilling. So this is beautiful. I think something is really developing because we don't make the analyses this way. When I take this, you can see that the things that politics is talking about isn't fed by the right analyses. And I think you've just made the right analysis. So we should do a next interview. What did we learn today? We learned today that we went from capitalist farming to family farming to the production of commodities in an environment that is under pressure. It cannot be anymore the way it was. And yet the potential is there, but how to develop it? That'll mean something for the common agricultural policy as well, for the Green Deal as well, how to use the competencies around in the Netherlands in Northwestern Europe. That is a theme. That is the theme you're putting to the table when you integrate your three themes. Niek, I think that is the integrating theme. So I propose to take them up, the three of them, for the next interview, and we'll see if one is still on the table. We'll have another interview and another interview, because we are really exploring this field and we're making a beautiful analysis. Do you agree?
That's fine.
I do.
The three of you.
I do.
Thank you very much, Krijn, Niek, Merijn. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a real conversation. 4 guys around a table discovering the analyses good politics, in fact, would have to do. And, well, we hope to bring the discussion forward and to bring rationality forward in order to get something done. Thank you very much. Thank you till the next show. We'll see you back. Bye-bye.